Thank you for listening to We Have Ways of Making You Talk. Sign up to our Patreon to receive bonus content, live streams, and our weekly newsletter with money off books and museum visits as well, plus early access to all live show tickets. That's patreon.com/wehaveways.
The summer is heating up with Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four.
Light 'em up, Johnny!
On July 25th.
Time to save the planet.
What's the plan?
Trust me, I hate that
It's a
plan.
bad plan. Come on.
Terrible
That's
idea.
a stupid plan.
Prepare for fantastic.
We will face this together as a family.
Marvel Studios' The Fantastic Four. First steps. Only in theaters July 25th. Rated PG-13. Some material may be inappropriate for children under 13. Get tickets now.
If you went on a road trip and you didn't stop for a Big Mac or drop a crispy fry between the car seats or use your McDonald's bag as a placemat, then that wasn't a road trip. It was just a really long drive. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to help you make the most of your summer with Michelob Ultra, a superior light beer worth playing for. Play for it with the guys when you're competing to see who can sink more birdies on the golf course, because winning tastes even better with Ultra on the line. Play for Ultra. Fill your fridge with Michelob Ultra this summer. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2025 Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
Achtung, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, and to part 2 of our Potsdam We're having our own big 3 here, aren't we?
Who's who? Well, you're obviously always Churchill.
I think I shall take the role of Churchill. I think Giles is bossing this, so he's Stalin.
That needs me to be Truman. I'm quite happy with that.
You got the atomic bomb up your sleeve, Jim, but will Stalin be impressed? That's the question. Or does he already know? Let's just quickly recap. So Roosevelt's dead, of course. So this is the new big 3. And he's replaced by Harry S. Truman, who doesn't want to go. I just love him saying, I'm getting ready to see Stalin and Churchill. It is a chore. I just think that's quite amazing. As an attitude, very strong. As we said, he's got the atomic bomb, the Trinity test. And this is one of the things that I think we've got to remember is that at the end of the war, in the American mind, they've got another 2 years of this stuff at least, and much more bloodshed to come. And obviously, historians have argued about the projected casualty figures since for the invasion of mainland Japan. But let's be honest now, it's going to be a bloodbath if Okinawa's anything to go by. And people who've listened to those episodes we've just done will know that. So Churchill's still PM, but his wartime coalition has imploded. Parliament's been dissolved, general elections called. But because of everyone overseas, basically, they've got to get the people's votes in, so they don't quite know the result yet. These things may be fated to us a result of the Cold War, but they don't know if the bomb's going to work. Churchill doesn't know if he's going to be PM. But what Stalin knows is that he's the winner at this stage. He's conquered countries that weren't even in his orbit. He's got new territories that are now part of his empire, if we're frank about it. And what are the allies, Western allies, going to be able to do about that? And then, of course, the cherry on the cake is that the French are not invited, which I think Jim in the last episode was pretty sympathetic with Stalin saying the French shouldn't be involved. But there we are. So we've set the scene. Just before the conference, as people gather, what happens? What's going on, Giles?
So the Soviets have to get the Cecilienhof Palace ready. One thing they do is they get geraniums, red geraniums, and they plant a giant Soviet star in the flower bed outside. It's a bit like sort of a dog peeing on a lamppost, just to mark their territory, that this is ours, you know. And they've shipped in a huge round table. And actually, I was there not so long ago. It's closed at the moment because they're turning the palace into a hotel, so people will be able to stay there. But they've kept the conference room exactly as it was in the summer of 1945.
And it's very atmospheric, isn't it?
It is an amazing room, yeah, with these sort of Tudor leaded windows and everything. Honestly, you feel like you're in a medieval, Elizabethan manor house. So this is a big brown table. They've got 3 big chairs, big heavy armchairs, one for Truman, one for Stalin, one for Churchill. Poor little Clement Attlee is sort of, sitting in a little chair behind Churchill. And then you have the delegations, the interpreters are there. So everything is going to take place round this one big table. They filled the place with everything they need, crystal glasses, plates, porcelain, everything for these grand banquets that they're going to have there. But one person, I read one account, which was fantastic, saying that while they were shipping stuff in for the conference, Soviets, Red Army soldiers were looting the outhouses of the palace and still carting stuff away. So it's kind of quite extraordinary, really. Each delegation is looking after itself, and there's a wonderful woman called Joan Bright, or Joan Bright Astley, as she became, who was really the conference organizer for the British delegation and wrote a wonderful book about her life at the top during the Second World War. She was PA to Pug Ismay. She worked alongside Churchill, and she organized the British delegation of the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences. And she describes, they each have Churchill has his manor house that he's been given, and likewise for Truman and Stalin. So they're going to live a life of unparalleled luxury while they're at the conference. There's going to be banquets, a lot of banquets. Food's been shipped in. Remember, there's no food in Berlin at the time. Berlin is a starving city, and yet they ship in enough food, the Soviets, to have lavish 25-course banquets, fish, chickens, turkeys, whatever, champagne, the works. And these are going to be quite an important part of the conference because they're not just doing business.
So there is a real sense that it's the Soviets that are hosting it. That's the vibe.
Yes, as they want, because they're showing we're in control. We're masters of this situation. We've already said they had all the shots, really. And so, so the conference opened. Truman does meet with Churchill beforehand. They each meet each other to sort of, get to know each other, as it were. But really, the conference starts mid-July. They're in this room. They're sitting around this table, and they begin to hammer out all the key things that needed to be decided for the planning of the post-war world. The war in the West has been won. The war in the East, as you've said, is still ongoing. And Germany, and a lot of Europe, but Germany particularly, is in a terrible mess. And they have to decide what they're going to do and how they're going to run the place.
Yeah. Churchill and Truman do a sightseeing tour in Berlin, don't they? So they have a look.
They do.
And are confronted with the destruction of the German capital. And did they take in Hitler's bunker? I mean, it just seems...
that was the highlight of every tour was all the GIs, all the British troops. Everyone wanted to go into the bunker, and there's some pretty vivid descriptions of the bunker. So it had been bombed very, very heavily, both by Allied bombers, but then in the final battle for Berlin as well. The place is in ruins. So you go down into the sort of bowels of the earth in Berlin. This magnificent structure, red marble everywhere, chandeliers, vast swastikas, eagles, and all. Everything is there, but it's all in ruins. Everything's on the ground. Everything's been smashed to pieces. There've been the last days of the Third Reich have seen, orgies taking place there. There are discarded champagne bottles everywhere. It's a real mess. And Churchill, he writes his own description of the place. He comes there and he's terribly depressed suddenly. And I think, and Truman as well, that they just see the utter destruction. Of course, Churchill's seen, London through the Blitz. London's been very badly damaged through the Blitz.
And this is on a completely different scale, isn't it?
They can't quite believe the scale of destruction in Berlin. This is a city in absolute ruins, and so hence they're in Potsdam, leafy Potsdam outside, which has been much less damaged. The Soviets first into the city, the first thing they have to do is clear some thoroughfares through the city. Who do they use to do that? There are no men in Berlin, at this time. It's a city of women and children, and so women are put to work. They become known as the rubble women, and their job is clear the streets of bricks and rubble, and really backbreaking work to try and at least get some sort of semblance of order into the city, at least get the main thoroughfares open. Now, of course, while you've got them doing that, and of course, there's rape on an unprecedented, horrific scale. I think 60,000 Berlin women sought medical help, but that number is dwarfed by the actual number. Some people might know the book by Anonymous called A Woman in Berlin, which we now know was written by Marta Hillers, which sets out the full horror of what women went through. And so you've got that on one side of the equation. On the other, you've got the Allied troops coming into Berlin in end of June, beginning of July, as victors as well. And they are masters of everything. They have unprecedented wealth. It's all black market. They've got cigarettes. They've got food as well, of course. So they see one guarantee against getting raped is to have a Western GI or soldier boyfriend who can fend off the Soviets. Now this is of course completely not allowed by the Allied armies. They've said that there's to be no fraternization whatsoever. And there is a $65 fine for any soldier that fraternizes with German women. And that becomes known as the $65 question. You know, expression we're probably familiar with is whether you're going to go and proposition a German woman. The other quip was that copulation without conversation is not fraternization, they would say. So you've got these Allied soldiers. They are masters of everything. There are two completely different universes taking place in Berlin. Starving Berliners, mainly women and children, and the Allied soldiers. About 25,000 Brits in Berlin, about 25,000 Americans as well. The French aren't even in the city yet. They seem to be left on the back foot for absolutely everything. So the Americans and Brits are dominating the city. So that's the sort of scene in Berlin at the time of the conference.
The rubble women thing is really, really interesting, I think, because obviously if the Americans were in Berlin, they'd have just brought in a bevy of bulldozers. You know, Lend-Lease doesn't extend to bulldozers, it only is to tanks.
But it's subjugation, Jim. Why use bulldozers when you can make the Germans do it? It's about rubbing their noses in it. The Soviet occupation is about, it feels like conquest from another era, doesn't it? And obviously they also think, you know, if it was good enough for them when they did it to us, it's good enough for us in return.
Oh, completely. But I'm just saying that the Americans would come at it from a completely different approach, wouldn't they?
Oh, no, I don't disagree with that. But how you characterize what the Soviets are doing, you know, they could have the bulldozers if they wanted, but they'd rather rub German noses in it. The sort of subjugation and oppression is the way they do things, rather than steel, not flesh or whatever, you know, rather than getting some machines to do it for them.
Those tremendous accounts of it all. There's also a brilliant novel by Joseph Cannon called The Good German. I don't know if you've ever come across that. I'd recommend that to anyone if they want a good novel on this subject.
I think one thing we can't stress enough, because it's going to be really, really important for the years as the years unfold after the conference, is to remember that the western sectors of Berlin are a tiny little island surrounded by a sea of red. Berlin falls well within the Soviet-occupied part of Germany. And this is going to, in the future, spell significant, in fact, a major problem for the Americans and Brits in Berlin, because the only access into Berlin is through one autobahn and one railroad that runs, you know, through Soviet-occupied Germany into Berlin. And what no one seems to have realized at the Potsdam Conference, which they really ought to have done, is that if things go wrong, if things go belly up with the Soviets, they only have to cut the railroad and the autobahn, and bingo, you've got a siege situation where the Western powers are trapped in Berlin without any outside support, you know. And I mean, this is moving things forward. But the other factor that comes into play here is that Berlin traditionally was fed by farmland to the east of the city, which is also controlled by the Soviets. So essentially, from day one, the Soviets control the food supply for Berliners. Now, the Brits and the Americans and the French are responsible for 2.5 million Berliners. They are responsible for feeding them, and they are dependent on the Soviets to do that.
And of course, this will all come to a head at the Berlin airlift, won't it, in June 1948?
The Berlin airlift, which is an amazing, one of the great achievements of the 20th century, but it's a really significant point that didn't seem to be taken on board at the conference, because everyone was assuming the wartime relationship would continue with the Soviet Union. No one, or very few people, spoke out loud, said, "Well, what happens if it breaks down? We're completely stuffed." You know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Churchill and Truman, they meet before the conference, don't they? I mean, Truman, having tried to avoid Churchill, basically, is now forced into meeting him. And Churchill tries a number on him, doesn't he, basically? Gives him praise and
gushes with charm, you know, just as he tried to do with Roosevelt. Here's Truman's diary. I've just got a couple of lines. He says, "He gave me a lot of hooey about how great my country is and how he loved Roosevelt and how he intended to love me." And then Truman says in his diary, "I'm sure we can get along if he doesn't try and give me too much soft soap." Churchill, you know, trying to charm him, Mr. President, and it's kind of not really working. Like you already said, Al, you know, Truman doesn't even want to be there. He wants to get back to America as quickly as possible. Doesn't particularly want to, you know, make friends with Churchill. He wants to do the business and get out. The businessman that he looks like, you know, in his natty suit.
Yeah, well, and he wants Europe done because he's got the Pacific to deal with. And Jim and I have come to this sort of understanding that that's the thing. It doesn't get talked about because it's so hard, baked in so hard to the American attitude, is that the Pacific War has
Pacific. Japan. Their work in Europe is done. And frankly, they don't really care anymore who has what in Europe. They've defeated Nazi Germany. That was always part of their deal.
One thing that does get discussed at the conference, which is going to be absolutely vital, not only to Germany, but to really the future of Western Europe, is, so at the conference, the decision is, reparations. Germany is going to be made to pay for the war, for the destruction it's caused. And also the German economy is going to be kept at a certain level. They don't want Germany to be a resurgent power again. And that's the common feeling between both the Western powers and the Soviet Union, that effectively Germany is going to be kept pretty crushed, and everything is going to change once the Western allies, once Truman realizes that actually Stalin is no longer an ally, that the Soviet Union can no longer be trusted. This is going to bring about a dramatic shift in policy. You're going to have the Marshall Plan, which many people would be familiar with. You're going to have the Truman Doctrine, and this is going to essentially develop into the containment of communism. And the containment of communism is going to mean rebuilding the economy of Western Germany, of the Western sectors of Germany.
And indeed, rebuilding the economies of the democratic world. I mean, that's the point. It's about, it is going to be a new world order in the West and a new world order in Eastern Europe in the Soviet sphere, behind the Iron Curtain. So, yeah, this is a pivotal moment. And it's Truman makes this great play when he takes over from Roosevelt on the evening of the 12th of April. That he's going to keep the same team, he's going to keep the same thing, he's going to continue with the same policies as Roosevelt. And he does to an extent. But very quickly, there is this big separation. And the one is no more conciliation towards the Soviet Union. That there is, as you point out, there is this acceptance that there is now us and there is them. And we're going to have to create this new world order in the sphere that we can influence. And the Soviet influence they'll have to be contained, as you say, on their little sphere as well.
The complication with that, though, is that by then the UN's been formed and everyone's tangled up together.
It is, but you mentioned George Kennan earlier. I think George Kennan is worth just reminding ourselves that this is a diplomat in Moscow in the American embassy, knows Stalin well, knows Stalin intimately. He knows the Soviet system and everything. And in 1946, so we're talking not long after the conference has taken place, he writes his famous long telegram. His long telegram sets out the fact that the Soviets can't be trusted. This post-war relationship should be shredded immediately, and that the Soviets have to be contained. And his telegram contains the one sort of famous line. He says, Soviet power is impervious to the logic of reason and highly sensitive to the logic of force. And one could bring that forward to Ukraine these days, couldn't it? That sort of rings down the decades, that sentence. But of course, none of this is known at the Potsdam Conference. They're still trading as allies, if you like. But this is only a few months afterwards. So it's amazing how quickly the whole thing is going to unravel.
So there are 7 points as to what's going to happen to Germany and Poland, which we've touched on a bit, but let's rattle through these. So Germany's going to be demilitarized, denazified, democratized, decentralized, basically pulled to pieces. And as we've already said, divided up into allied zones. All Nazi law is to be abolished. Germany and Austria to be divided into occupation zones, as agreed at Yalta, with the capitals divided. Nazi war criminals to be tried. How that actually pans out, you get Nuremberg, and you do get a fair slice of people being tried, but also it presents you with an enormous problem, which is arrest everyone who was in the Nazi party. How can you do that? If you want Germany to continue to exist. Germany's eastern border shifted westwards to the Oder-Neisse line, which shrinks Germany by 25%, which creates an enormous refugee problem.
25% of the country gone.
I know. It's amazing, isn't it? And in sharp contrast to Versailles, where there's this sort of, well-meaning attempt to create, self-determination of peoples within Europe, within the collapsed Austro-Hungarian Empire. Sod that is Stalin's attitude. I'm going to decide where the borders are. This is in his remit, isn't it? This new border.
Yeah. And Al, the scale of that, there's a great book, but I don't know if you know Keith Lowe, who wrote a book called Savage Continent. And it says, I think it was 11 million ethnic Germans were kicked out of their their hereditary homes, And this was, mass sort of movement of populations on an unprecedented scale, lives absolutely ruined. Well, a lot of people didn't have much sympathy for these people, but nevertheless, it was a staggering biblical sort of movement of populations.
Yeah, Katja Hoyer's written about, people from Prussia essentially ending up in Western Germany. And they're like, who are you people? You're not welcome here. Your food's wrong. You're a reminder of the war, of the disaster that befell Germany, all this and all this sort of stuff. That's a thing that, hangs on for the decades that follow, as much as anything else. People are strangers in their own country, in a sense. And then these border shifts are accompanied by orderly and humane, and I did the magic inverted comma fingers then, expulsions of German populations from those eastern sectors. This millions and, as you said, millions of people. And then reparations, which we talked about in the first episode, which are physical reparations for the Soviets as far as they're concerned. They're actually going to take stuff as well as demand money. And I think part of the tone here is Versailles didn't work. That's one of how people understand the Nazi rise to power. And, the Versailles Treaty wasn't firm enough, didn't put Germany in its place enough. This is very much characteristic of this, isn't it? It's to really let them know they've lost, right?
Yeah. And I think that's part of the thing you mentioned, denazification, which is possibly one of the most absurd things that they tried to do. Every single German had to fill out this long questionnaire, and then they were ranked according to how Nazi they were. And if you came out whiter than white, you were no Persil shine, yes, yeah, because you're as white as Persil washing powder. But the problem was, you're managing tens of millions of people, and it's being run by Americans and Brits, most, who don't speak German. So, it was never going to work. It was a completely absurd. Maybe the intention was good, but it wasn't going to work, and it all fell apart quite quickly.
Well, and then the politics overtook things. That once you need a Western Germany on side, you're going to have to, as the Cold War emerges, you're just going to have to drop this, aren't you?
Oh, and the Soviets did that from day one. The day that literally when they arrived in Berlin, they thought, well, he was a senior Nazi. Well, sod that. We'll take him anyway because he knows what he's doing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then the plan for Poland is a Soviet government, isn't it? Let's be honest now.
Yeah, a Soviet government.
We've moved borders. That's the other really, really key point. This
massively moved borders, yeah. And the Soviet government has been formed by Stalin in Moscow. It's been up and running for some time, and the idea, or Churchill's idea, once he realizes the Polish government in exile in London had its day, he then tries to get some of them into this new, Stalin's new Soviet government. Even that doesn't work, So you end up with exactly what Stalin wanted and intended, which was, to have a pro-Soviet government in Poland. And actually, just to rewind, it's worth something, one of the most cynical things that Stalin did, I think, was calling on the population of Warsaw to rise up against their German masters, intimating that the Red Army would go in and help them. And of course, it did absolutely nothing, despite beggings and pleadings from the Western powers for the Red Army, which was right there, right by Warsaw, to go in to help the uprising. Stalin did nothing, because for Stalin, it was an extremely useful way of getting rid of all the sort of democratic forces, the forces that essentially like the West. Well, it was a very good way of getting them killed in advance of him taking control of Poland. It's unbelievably cynical. And people like Averell Harriman and the British ambassador in utter despair going into Stalin, and he would have nothing to do with it.
Well, yeah, you said right at the very beginning of this series, Giles, that he was the ultimate malevolent negotiator. We should probably take a break, and then when we come back, we can just see how malevolent he was.
Hey, it's Paris. I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and Auto Camp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
My cat Freddie loves to be brushed and cuddled. But stirring up his cat allergens meant sneezing and itchy eyes. Then I found Purina One Live Clear. It's cat food that reduced the major allergen and my suffering in as little as 21 days. Now, we feel closer than ever. If you have issues with cat allergens, you really need to try Purina One Live Clear.
Try new Purina One Live Clear today. Purina One, a difference from day one.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. Between two-factor authentication, strong passwords, and a VPN, you try to be in control of how your info is protected. But many other places also have it, and they might not be as careful. That's why LifeLock monitors hundreds of millions of data points a second for threats. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast for 40% off. Terms apply.
Welcome back to We Have Ways to Make You Talk with the big three. Me, Jim, and Giles. I'm definitely Churchill because I'm exhausted. I've had enough.
I'm all right being Stalin, actually, because I know I'm going to win.
You can bug out, Al, and we'll get JR on and he could be Clement Attlee.
You know, I don't mind handing over to a deputy. Well, my former deputy. So basically, Stalin's negotiation style, you know, and we have touched on this, mentioning Putin, let's be honest now, there is a Russian negotiation style, which is a maximalist demand, isn't it? And then absolutely no concessions. That's the Russian negotiating style, it's the Soviet negotiating style. It's Stalin's, isn't it?
Yeah, you got it in a nutshell there. Basically, he knows what he wants. And the thing is, by 1945, he knows he's going to get it as well. I mean, he's already got essentially what he wants, which is control of Eastern and Central Europe. So doesn't really need to throw his weight around too much because the work's already been done for him.
And I love this line from Anthony Eden, saying that if he had to pick a negotiating team, he'd pick Stalin to lead it. I mean, there's sort of grudging admiration there, isn't there?
That's very funny.
Avril Harriman, at the end of the war, he wrote an appraisal of the big three wartime leaders. And he said, without a doubt, Stalin was head and shoulders above Churchill and Roosevelt when it came to negotiating. He also said, and this will surprise some people, that Stalin in private was the most courteous, the most genteel, the politest person he'd ever dealt with. And Avril himself, he said, I found it really difficult, he said, to square this with the fact that I'm sitting opposite a mass murderer who's liquidated millions of his own people. And yet, to me personally, he was always a model of charm. And I think it's fascinating because it gets to the heart of Stalin, really, that here's this evil, monstrous dictator who could just switch on the charm whenever he needed to.
That's fascinating. I mean, no one ever describes Hitler as charming, do they? No, but you know what I mean.
Not even those who love him.
Not even those who love him. Charm is never part of the package, is it? JR just asked on our little chat here, would you say Stalin is a sociopath? That's a modern term, right? I think sociopaths are Stalins, aren't they? I think we're better off with it that way round, right?
Yeah, it's so hard. You know, when I started researching this whole subject and everything, I had the sort of vision of Stalin that I think everyone has, this idea that he was just this, you know, brutal mass murderer, hands dripping in blood and everything. And actually, it's much more nuanced. And he was so intelligent in a very nasty way, you know, so manipulative in a very clever way. He was so well read, and he had a vast library of books, and he annotated everything that he read, you know. And if he disagreed with something, he used to write piss off in the margin, which I rather liked. So this was this guy who'd been born into this impoverished Georgian family. You know, his father was an alcoholic who used to beat his wife and everything. He emerged into something very, very different. And I think this is what was so misunderstood in the capitals of, you know, in Washington, in Whitehall. They didn't believe the diplomats saying, just be really careful, you're dealing with a genius in his own way, you know. They kept saying, one Archie Clark Kerr, who was the British ambassador in Moscow, he said, you know, we're treating, he sort of saw the whole situation as a private gentleman's club, you know, and he's saying that we're sort of the doorman not letting Stalin into the club. And he said, we should be letting him into the club. We should be sitting down and wining and dining with him. You know, we've got to treat this guy seriously. And honestly, time and time again, you get this coming through the memos, the telegrams going back to the capitals.
It's fascinating, though, because to get to the top of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, you're not going to be an idiot, are you? It requires incredible cunning. And as you say, cynicism is really the key to him, isn't it?
And just total ruthlessness.
Yeah, and total ruthlessness.
I read the Soviet diplomats' accounts of the Potsdam Conference as well, and all of them, it's really interesting, they were united in their feeling that Stalin had played a blinder. Like they said, this was an absolute triumph for Soviet diplomacy, you know, that he got everything he wanted.
And in contrast, Churchill's all over the place, isn't he? I mean, we touched on this earlier on, that he's drinking too much, he's rambling, he seems exhausted. But I think it's really interesting that Eden and Cadogan, who are big fans and, you know, have been loyal colleagues and friends of his for a long time, even they're in despair, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, their letters home, you know, they would write letters to their wives about Churchill and say, rather than the official documents, this is what they really felt, you know, and they're in despair. They're just saying, oh my God, he's just giving everything away. And, you know, Stalin's stomping around going, I like that great man, Stalin, you know, and they're just saying they really are in despair at his performance. And I think the one person who could have made a difference at this conference is the figure of Ernest Bevin, who, in my mind, you know, one of the great foreign secretaries of the 20th century, and a rather overlooked figure, I think. But Ernest Bevin, you know, to paint a picture, you have Anthony Eden, the kind of old Etonian, Oxbridge educated, you know, always in his three-piece suit and everything, you know, speaks this wonderful sort of eloquent English. And then you've got Ernest Bevin, former lorry driver, from a very, very impoverished background. Anyway, he arrived at the conference and his first words were, I'll not have Britain barged about. He was always called a pugnacious heavyweight. He was a pugnacious heavyweight. And get this is wonderful. At one point, he so disagreed with Molotov, what Molotov was saying, that he actually stood up and went to punch him in the face. And he had to be held back by his own team. And I just think that's sort of wonderful. That takes gunboat diplomacy to the ultimate limit, you know. So I think that, you know, had the results of the election come earlier and had the conference, Clement Attlee gone there with Ernest Bevin at the beginning of the conference, I think perhaps they might have made some difference. But the bottom line was that, as we've said already, the Red Army controls everything that Stalin wants. You know, it's a win-win for the Soviets.
Yeah. And what about Truman then?
Yeah. What about Truman?
So Truman, we mentioned earlier, Truman has his ace card. He's received this news that the atomic bomb has worked. Now, he doesn't know whether he should tell Stalin or not this news, and he talks it over with Churchill. And Churchill says, "Oh yeah, I think we should tell him," you know. And Truman says, "Okay, I'm going to do it, you know, tomorrow night or whatever." Churchill is going to be watching to see Stalin's expression when Truman tells him we've got an atomic bomb. So Truman goes over to Stalin, sidles up to him, doesn't say atomic bomb. He says, "We've produced a weapon of unprecedented, you know, destructive force." And he's expecting some sort of big reaction from Stalin. And Stalin just goes, "Oh, that's good. I hope you use it against the Japanese." And he's really surprised by this reaction. Of course, what he doesn't realize is that Stalin knows absolutely everything about the American atomic program. He's had his spies have infiltrated the whole Trinity.
This is Cairncross and everything, isn't it?
Yeah, he knows everything. He knows everything.
Well, John Cairncross is one of the Cambridge spies that's affected.
But Stalin's been playing games with Truman anyway, because he's told him that he thinks Hitler's not dead and has got away and is in Western Germany, doesn't he?
That's an incredibly shocking thing that he says, actually. If you sort of think about it, Stalin knows for sure that Hitler's dead. You know, he's seen the dental records, he's seen the jawbone and everything. He knows that Hitler is dead. And yet he intimates that that Hitler has escaped and is living in British-occupied Germany. It's a fabulously nefarious accusation to make against your kind of allied, you know, your wartime ally.
Those things continue, you know, for several years, you know, and quite often it's just a sort of a means of testing British and American intelligence systems and how they react and all the rest of it.
Well, making them chase their tails. I mean, waste their time. We have banquets as the sort of core of the event, don't we? Banquets with the big three. As you said before, everything's laid out. There's tables, and it's lavish. Even though Berliners are starving, this is a really fantastic spread that's laid on. It's caviar, it's champagne, it's all the trimmings, right?
Yeah, I mean, again, Truman says, he writes a letter home. He said, Stalin gave his state dinner. It was a wow. They had watermelon, champagne, smoked fish, fresh fish, venison, chicken, duck. I mean, you know, this is in a city, like you say, that's starving.
Well, and I also like the fact that Truman hosts one the night before and has a pianist and a violinist. And then the following night it's Stalin's turn and he has two pianists, two violins.
Two of each. And Truman writes back home and he says the musicians that Stalin brought in, they were two female musicians. He said they're rather fat and none too clean.
Yeah. And Churchill's is the dud banquet, isn't it?
Churchill's bored by these banquets, but he's particularly bored by Stalin's banquet. He says to tries to get Truman to leave. He says, "Should we go now?" And Truman says, "Well, actually, I'm quite enjoying myself. No, I don't want to leave." And Churchill's by now, he's furious and he starts plotting his revenge. And he thinks, right, tomorrow night, it's my turn. And he gets the RAF brass band to play throughout the banquet. No one can hear anything at all, and he's sitting there sniggering, thinking, well, I got one up on them.
Part of this, though, is the heavy drinking that goes with this, the sort of Russian-style heavy drinking, although Stalin doesn't drink, so keeps himself sober throughout. I mean, part of Churchill's distaste for this, he's been humiliated, hasn't he, in Tehran previously with toasts, where he feels the toasts are out of control and that Stalin's sort of snubbing him, isn't he? So he's got he's got no energy, but also he's had a bad experience before, hasn't he?
Yeah, you're right to say, by the way, Stalin didn't drink vodka, so he always had a vodka shot in front of him, but it was full of water. He drank Georgian wine, often diluted, so he was very, very happy to watch other people getting completely plastered, particularly if it was Churchill. But he always remained sober himself. But yeah, he could always, Stalin could come out with some fabulously barbed comments, particularly when he was with Churchill. I mean, one of the ones I really loved, because it was so fantastically rude and Churchill was so offended by it, was he started talking about the Gallipoli landings at one point, and he said they failed because of stupidities in planning and execution. Said that directly to Winston Churchill, knowing obviously full well Churchill's role in them. So he was a master of the barbed comment, and they often came out at these dinners. One of the most famous ones was Stalin said at the end of the war, I think this was at Tehran, he said at the end of the war, I think we should execute 50,000 German, senior German military guys. And Churchill is horrified by this and so absolutely outrageous. And he's even more horrified when Roosevelt takes that line and he says, maybe not 50,000. Why not? Why don't we do 49,000? So he plays along with Stalin. And that's another example of these. They're playing each other off against each other all the time. At one point, Roosevelt turns to Stalin and says, I think the two of us can solve the problem of British India, without Winston Churchill. So, it's pretty extraordinary stuff. We have this idea often that, Roosevelt and Churchill had a common viewpoint and were coming to these conferences with a united front. Not a bit of it. They're scoring points of each other all the time.
Yeah.
But there is this hiatus in the middle, which, of course, is the British election. And Churchill and Attlee go home on the 25th of July. And then Churchill stays there. Attlee comes back, now obviously with Ernest Bevin as well, rather than Anthony Eden. So it's not just the Prime Minister that's changed. It's all the people around him. Is that a big turning point? There's the conference, it wraps up on the 2nd of August. You've also got the Potsdam Declaration on the 26th of July, which is aimed at, of course, at Japan. But it's kind of done and dusted, really, by the time Churchill goes, isn't it? The big issues have been discussed, and really there's not much to resolve because, as you say, Stalin's in the driving seat and he's in the Berlin. He's got his Red Army troops throughout much of Eastern Europe. And what else can the Western Allies do except suddenly, realize to their horror that they've got, they're not going to be able to progress into the New World Order with the alliance continuing. This is it. This is the start of the Cold War, isn't it?
You're right. And Joan Bright, the lady who helped set up the British delegation and organised the conference and everything, she actually writes in her memoirs, it's rather sort of touching line. She says, Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin came back to the conference. She said, but it was not the big three anymore. The magic had gone. The big players, she felt Churchill was one of the big players, had gone. And you're right, all the major decisions had been taken or were going to happen by default because of the Red Army in charge of East and Central Europe. I think Churchill is now in opposition. And this is where his viewpoint begins to change. And he begins to view Stalin not as his best buddy and wartime ally, but actually as the guy who is now rapidly turning into the enemy. And remember, it's only months after the end of the Potsdam Conference. So if we wind forwards to February 1946, Churchill goes to Missouri, the home state of President Truman, and delivers in front of the world's media
The Iron Curtain speech, isn't it?
Iron Curtain speech from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic. An Iron Curtain has descended over the continent. This is a complete U-turn in Churchill's thinking. The Soviet ally has gone from being the Soviet ally to being the Soviet monster. And this is there are a number of things that happen. In fact, at the very beginning of 1946, that is a key thing. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech. We've mentioned the George Kennan's long telegram where he says, "My God, we've got to contain this Soviet beast."
Because that's also delivered in 46 as well. So
that's delivered in early
46. I think that's February, yes, and because the Iron Curtain speech is March, isn't it? So Kennan comes in February.
And there's a third thing that happens in the early spring of 1946, which is really important, is that Igor Guzenko, who's a Soviet cipher clerk in the Soviet embassy in Ottawa in Canada, he defects. And he doesn't just defect, he defects with a whole batch of documents proving that the Soviets have infiltrated the American atomic program. And this is an electrifying sort of piece of news.
Yes, because it means that the Soviets are going to have an atomic bomb soon too.
It does mean that as well. But, this changes everything. And I think, so where, the question is often asked, when does the Cold War start? Well, you could argue it starts in Berlin in 45, but I think really it begins, the Cold War heats up, if you like, in the very beginning of 1946. Everything's changed. The Soviet ally is no longer an ally. It's now increasingly seen as the enemy.
I mean, are there any positives for the Western allies in this? I mean, apart from, Stalin promises that in 90 days' time he'll come to the fight in the Japanese in Manchukuo, and he does, bang on time. Operation August Storm starts exactly as promised. 90 days after the end of the war, Europe will deploy and will attack the Japanese. And Truman writes in his diary, doesn't he? I've got him on board for Japan. I'm cock a hoop about this, doesn't he? Is that the crumb of comfort? And is that because the Americans, they want out of Europe? That's their priority. They want to get Japan done. And if they can get the Soviets to do it for them, particularly as they have equipped the Soviet army, after all, with Lend-Lease, is that the Western Allied win in all this?
Well, it is in the sort of immediate aftermath of the conference. But I think really the big win, I would argue, is the Marshall Plan, the massive injection of American finance into Europe, the rebuilding of the German economy, the introduction of a new currency into Germany, which transforms the economic situation in West Germany. All of these come in the sort of aftermath of the Potsdam Conference. And if there's a win for the West, that's it, I would have thought.
Yeah, it is remarkable because it is the first time ever that the victors have economically bailed out the vanquished. I mean, it is a remarkable thing that happens, the Marshall Plan. I mean, really, really extraordinary.
And Al, of course, one other thing which we have to mention, I think, is out of this chaos is born NATO, and that's absolutely crucial, with its Article 5, I think it is, which famously states an attack on one is an attack on all. This will prevent wars for, we're still living through this, for it seems like history.
And we're recording this on the eve of the latest NATO conference, so it'll be fascinating to see how that plays out.
Yeah. And then, of course, the formation of NATO then leads directly to the formation of the Warsaw Pact. And so there, you have your two blocks of the Cold War. The stage is set for the onset of the Cold War.
Well, Giles, that's been absolutely brilliant. Thank you. That's a tour de force, and brilliant to have you back on the show. And thank you for that, because I don't know about you, that's just absolutely fascinating, isn't it? And I'm obsessed with all this at the moment because, of course, in the light of what's happening in the world stage at the moment, and the shifting of tectonic plates as we speak. So all of this is just fabulous background to that and context. And also, I think it really, really does underline the sort of, the long arm of the Second World War and how it affects us to this very day.
Well, and also that contingency within an event can then cast great long shadows across the future. When they arrive with various shopping lists, the general election, the fact it's not Roosevelt, the fact that, all these things, and that personality. And I think there is an irony, isn't there, that the head of the Soviet Union, which espouses an idea that history is not about individuals, it's about mass movements. His personality is key to the outcome of this conference. And that yes, it's the mass might of the Soviet Union, but it's him. He's the immovable object at the head of the irresistible force that is the Soviet Union. And it's him, it's Stalin, it's his personality. It's absolutely key to this, which sort of rather pulls the rug from under some of his thinking, perhaps, that he might espouse, which I think is fascinating.
If I'm allowed, you can edit this out if you want to plug my book, Checkmate in Berlin. It covers all of this subject, the early years of the Cold War from the Berlin perspective.
Well, Checkmate in Berlin, also the Stalin affair, and I also would recommend listeners to your Ministry of Secrets podcast series you did, Giles, which I was completely obsessed with when it came out. It was completely brilliant about the mystery of the naval diver Buster Crabbe. It's just an amazing Cold War story. Khrushchev in arriving in the South Coast and in Portsmouth and all sorts of stuff. I mean, whoever knew? I mean, just incredible. Mountbatten's involved, all sorts of secrets and people under the carpets and the floorboards. It's just incredible.
Come on, Giles. Did Buster Crabbe defect? Come on.
Oh, you'll have to listen. But look, the big question is, why is the current government still refusing to release the Buster Crabbe papers? It's all revealed in the podcast.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Giles. Thanks, everyone, for listening. We'll see you again very soon. Cheerio.
Cheerio.
Bye.